Hey, MadLab Nation, how you doing? Rainmaker podcast, Greg Mack. Hope things are going well. Thanks for joining in and taking a listen to what we got today for you. I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about the interviewing process again and reinforcing the questioning concepts and what we're really trying to get across and find out in the interviewing process. And one of the key transition points for us in terms of decision making is the identification of suspect to prospect and then prospect to client. And so when we try to see if a suspect, someone we think, right, is a candidate for what we do professionally, what turns them into a prospect for us is somehow they express an emotion that's associated with a physical issue, need, complaint, desire that they have for their bodies. Again, that's in our wheelhouse as professional exercise, movement, health, wellness coaches and trainers. So what does this mean, this idea of emotion? I mean, we can ask questions to search for facts: age, do they exercise, do they have injuries, what do they eat, right? All kinds of fact-based questions. But we're also looking for information that is of an emotional nature. And if you're familiar with the Rainmaker content, and for those of you who aren't, one of the content domains that we lean on of the 4 or 5 that constitute the philosophies and methodologies of the coursework is from transactional analysis, which was developed by Dr. Eric Byrne and his colleagues several decades ago. And what's interesting about what transactional analysis does and what I like about it is some of its simplicity in terms of its language. And they look at emotions as primarily falling in 4 or 5 categories, right? And they have emotions that are associated with the present, and those 2 emotions are happiness, which generally reflects for the person who has happiness and feeling happy, means that they don't want anything to change right now. Everything can just keep going the way that it is. Authentic anger is something has to change in the present, and they're not happy about something, so it's antithetical to happiness, and they want something to change. Emotions that have to do with the past are categorized under the general notion of sadness. And emotion that has to do with the future primarily do with the emotion associated with fear. And there are various degrees of each of these emotions. You can have happiness and joy, exuberant joy. And you could have happiness, which just might be a mild satisfaction. You can have an anger that is rage, and you can have an anger that is frustration. You can have sadness that is profound sorrow, and you can have sadness that is not as deeply felt as sorrow. And you can have fear that is horror, and you can have a fear that is an anxiety about uncertainty. And so, there are relative degrees and words to describe the relative degrees of these 4 basic categories of authentic emotion. And so we've got to ask questions and develop question structures that start to target and extract information about the emotion of the client. And so you've heard me before encourage you that when you meet a stranger and somebody that you want to see whether or not they're a prospect and whether you want to get a prospect to consider a decision that both of you make to become clients, that I want you to get into the backstory, right? And get into their narrative, their stream of consciousness, and go back in history and find out what's been going on. And when you're talking about history, you may elicit and find some sadness about something that's happened in the past, and that's okay. Now, we want to talk about the present. And usually when you meet somebody, they're talking about the present and whether they're happy or angry. And so if they're happy, they're probably not going to be a prospect. There's really nothing to change by definition. And so when you're in the stream of consciousness, when you're in the narrative and you're in the backstory and you come up to the present, you may run into and ask some questions about their current emotional state. And if there's anger or frustration associated with something in the present. But remember, we want to project into the future, right? So we want to build the past, present, and future, because in the conversations, we need them in the mindset of future when we go to make an invitation about coming in for a face-to-face or coming in for an assessment or the initial process you have in place once they make a decision to enter their professional relationship, at least the first stage. And so we need questions in the future that have to do with anger. And so for those of you who finished Rainmaker and have been through all of the process, and you remember the pain step, which is what the Sandler system calls it, this let's find the emotional component, which is where most of the value is established. The level of anger, the level of fear, the type of fear and anger really are the things that they want solved. So when someone's angry, guess where they want to get back to? Happiness. When someone's fearful, guess what they don't want to think about anymore? Something terrible in the future or something they don't want. And so these are the things that we're wondering if they exist. We're not trying to make them exist. We're not trying to make somebody emotional or take on an emotional state that doesn't, really reflect their authentic psycho-emotional processes. We just want to unveil it and see if it's even there. And so we need to ask questions about their emotions. And you've got to ask them how things would feel if things didn't change in the future. Why is it that they want to make a change? And what would that change do for them? And so these are the kind of questions you want to start to build and construct. So I'd encourage you to sit down with yourself and maybe some of your colleagues and start to ask some questions and formulate questions that are designed to probe and see if there's any emotional concerns associated with their physical issues and what they might be angry about or frustrated about, or what they might be fearful about or uncertain about or anxious about, so that you can see what those things are, because ultimately they are the measure, the metric of the relationship, at least in the short and mid-range, independent of how many push-ups they can do and how many repetitions of anything they can do in a certain period of time, or how much they can squat. And all these things are important and valuable objective measurements. But ultimately, if the objective measurements and the objective increases that you're trying to gain in terms of their physical performance capabilities, aren't moving them or helping them deal with or relieve the anger or fear, then it's all for naught. And you may need to make a professional refer to them. And this is tricky business for us, right? Coaching is psychological. You know this. And so we're dealing with psychology without having PhDs in psychology or MDs in psychiatry. And so I would encourage you to find and align yourself with some counselors in your community who may need to come in and help you or support the process a little bit, because even though we need to know about the emotion, the anger or the fear or the derivatives of thereof of these particular emotions, we're not directly trying to treat them, right, in a medical sense. We just know that's really, the motive force, the thing that could drive the changes they need to make in their thinking, in their behavior, to adopt these strategies and these lifestyle processes that we want them to adopt. Because if things don't change, they will stay angry and they will stay fearful. And these are the things that we're hoping we can help them with in terms of the physical side, because the research is clear, isn't it? the mind-body connection, the psychology and physical body connections are quite profound. I was just reading some research on this recently about physical activity and its impact on emotional stressors. And it can be important. It could push you either way, and the exercise and wellness process can become overwhelming for somebody and add to their stress and fear and anxiety. So that's why it's so important to connect to that part of your client and make that part of your coaching relationship early on, and find that out in the sales process and revisit it frequently and check in with that as you progress the professional relationship over time, because it may change and they may get to a state of happiness where they don't want any change. And maybe that means they're just going to stay where they are and hopefully stay with you. That could be the reason why a lot of people stop the relationship with you, because whatever the issue was emotionally, it's been resolved and they feel like, okay, I don't need to exercise anymore. I've had enough. And so that requires some real education on our parts to help them understand that in order to stay where they are or sustain their current level of satisfaction with their life and their lifestyle, they may need to continue exercising regularly and adopt these healthy habits and keep you as a coach to help them navigate this and keep this in their life for as long as they're alive, at least in your community. So that's the tip I wanted to give you today, and hopefully you'll work on that a little bit and remember that 4 primary emotions, right? Sadness is about the past and all its derivatives. Anger and happiness is about the present. Happiness being, let's just stay like this. This is all good. Anger is something better change. And fear is about the future and all of its derivatives. And so see if it exists. And you got to ask questions in addition to the fact-based ones that you need to help make an informed decision about whether or not this professional relationship should move forward.